Welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to look at who owns what in the cloud. And by owns, we're talking about who is responsible for what in the cloud. So the first thing I'm going to do is give you an analogy of renting a car. Then we're going to look at renting resources in the cloud. And then we're going to look at the crux of this lecture, which is the shared responsibility model. And it comes up time and time again in the Certified Solutions Architect associate exam, as well as the security specialty and a whole bunch of other exams. So if you do want to go on and do other exams with AWS, you need to know the shared responsibility model inside out. We're just going to touch upon it briefly in this lecture. I would highly recommend by the time you finish the end of this course that you go and actually read the shared responsibility model on AWS's website, and we'll have a link to it in the resources section. And then we'll cover off our exam tips. So I want you to think, when you go and rent a car, who is responsible for what? What is your responsibility and what is the car rental company's responsibility? Well, at a high level, you're responsible for not to damage the vehicle when you're in control of it. You're responsible not to speed and get any speeding fines, and you're responsible for paying things like tolls, for example. Whereas the rental car's responsibility is the car itself. So they have to be in charge of things like the tire pressure. They have to make sure there's enough air in the tires to responsibly lend it to you. And they have to make sure it has a full tank of gas when they give it to you. And their overall responsibility is in the mechanics of the car. There's no point giving you a car if it's suddenly going to break down. Let's say the exhaust is about to fall off. So they're responsible for the physical parts of the car, and you're responsible for what you do with the car. And it's very similar in the cloud. So who is responsible for what when you rent resources in the cloud? What are you responsible for, and what is Amazon responsible for? And that's where the shared responsibility model comes in. So let's talk about Amazon's responsibility. They're responsible for security of the cloud. So they're responsible for the regions, the availability zones, the edge locations. They basically don't advertise, where the availability zones are, where the data centers are, because they don't want people just rocking up at their data centers trying to get in. They're responsible for the physical security of the data centers. So to get in, you have to go through security checkpoints. There'll be chain link fencing around the data centers, etc., etc. They're responsible for the hardware and all the physical assets within the data center. They're responsible for the computers, the storage, the databasing, the network, and the overall software that runs the entire stack. So things like the hypervisor, for example, and this basically just controls the virtualization on top of the physical components of AWS's cloud. So what are you responsible for? Well, you're responsible for what you do with the cloud. You're responsible for the security in the cloud. So you're responsible for your customer data. You don't want to store that in a place that's publicly accessible where anyone can download it. If you do that, that's your fault. That's not Amazon's. You're responsible for things like your platform, the applications, identity and access management, which we're going to cover off in the next section. You're responsible for the configuration of your operating systems on your virtual machines, the network and firewall configurations. You're responsible for client-side encryption as well as server-side encryption. And you're also responsible for generally just protecting your network traffic. Now, if you don't come from a tech background, a lot of these are new words to you. Don't worry. As we go throughout the course, it'll make a lot more sense. That's why I recommend reading the shared responsibility model at the end of the course. We're going into the exam. Basically, this is our exam tips. I want you to think, when you get a scenario question, they're talking about who's responsible for what. Ask yourself, can you do this yourself in the AWS Management Console? And if you can, then you're likely responsible. For example, security groups, IAM users, patching your EC2 operating systems, patching your databases running on EC2, etc. Because you can do this in the AWS console, you are going to be responsible. And again, if you don't understand what any of those words mean, don't worry about it. We are going to cover it off later on. But essentially, you're responsible for the things that you can control. If you can't control it, then AWS is most likely responsible. So you can't control how AWS manage their data centers. You can't control what security cameras are turned on. You can't control the cabling that they've put into their data centers, or the patching of, their database servers or their operating systems, etc. The security patching of that. You can't control that. So if you can't control that, then most likely AWS is responsible. So as you go into your exam, if you do get a scenario-based question talking about the shared responsibility model, who's responsible for what, I just want you to ask this one question in your head. Can I do this myself in the AWS Management Console? And if you can, then you're probably going to be responsible. And if not, then AWS is likely to be responsible. We have a shared responsibility between the two of you is encryption. So you can do encryption, AWS can do encryption. For you, you can encrypt your client's data. You can make sure that where you store all your client's data, that it is encrypted. AWS, when you go in into the console and click a button saying, please encrypt this volume. When you click that, you doing the encryption on your side. AWS actually has to follow through and make sure that that is encrypted. So that's why encryption is a shared responsibility. So keep all this in mind going into the exam. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.